We're not crazy, the system is. Tune in to Madness Radio, voices and visions from outside mental health. Wednesdays, 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern Time on Pacifica affiliate WXOJLP-FM 103.3 Valley Free Radio. Produced by Freedom Center and the Icarus Project, streaming live, podcasting, and archived at madnessradio.net. Welcome to Madness Radio. I'm your host, Will Hall. Madness Radio is co-produced by Freedom Center and the Icarus Project. Freedom Center is a Northampton, Massachusetts-based mental health alternatives and human rights group run by and for people who've been labeled with psychiatric disorders and who are looking for different ways of healing and different ways of living outside of the mental health system. You can find out more information about Freedom Center at our website, which is freedom-center.org. Madness Radio is also co-produced by the Icarus Project, which is an international support network of people living outside the mainstream medical model of mental illness and who are exploring different approaches, including creativity and spirituality. The website is theicarusproject.net. Today we have a collection of different voices, including a short documentary about the extermination of psychiatric patients in Nazi Germany, and an interview with Freedom Center organizer Vikki Gilbert. But first, I spoke with 17-year-old Sonia Peterson. Sonia was locked up in psych wards at age 12, and she talks with us about her experiences. So I'm here at the Germantown farm in Germantown, New York. And actually, there's a bunch of chicks here, so here's the voice of the chicks. And there's baby goats, farming, and what were we doing before?
Picking rocks and weeding the garden. My name is Sonia Peterson, and I'm 17, and I live in Saugerties, New York.
And I just wanted to talk to you about some of your experiences in the mental health system and being out of the mental health system. And you said you were in a hospital at age 12. How did that happen? What was it that got you into the hospital at such a young age 12?
I was coming off as a normal kid pretty much, and then stuff was happening, so that my mom was like, let's go to an intake at the Ulster County, mental health facility. And so we went for an intake, and I didn't know what an intake was, but we were going to do it anyways. And I'd seen therapists and psychiatrists a little bit when I was younger, for things like skipping out on school. So I went to this intake, whatever that was, for me when I was 12. And it was kind of scary because the intake was an hour. And then for some reason they wanted to keep me 2 hours. And then they wanted me to stay for 3 hours. And the intake person was very worried. And she talked to my mom when I was out of the room. And they brought a psychiatrist in. And then they said, you can't go home tonight. You're going to go to the hospital. I didn't know why. They said, you're severely depressed. And that didn't make any sense to me. Had you been telling your mom you were suicidal or something? Or what was it that was happening that led you to go to the intake in the first place? You said you were skipping out on school and... Well, I skipped out on school like all the way through grade school. I mean, school's always been a troublesome place for me. I don't really like school. But no, I was spending the nights like I couldn't sleep. I couldn't go to sleep. And I was never really good at going to sleep, but I wouldn't go to sleep. It was like cry and cry and cry. I couldn't get to sleep. One night was very bad, and I was like hitting my head. I remember my mom telling me I was hitting my head against things, telling her to get the voices out of my head, kind of thing, or the images or whatever. And so we went to the emergency room, and then a week later I was at this intake, with professional people. But no, I mean, I never said anything about being suicidal or anything like that.
And they just said, okay, we're locking you up at age 12.
Yeah, they didn't really give me a choice in the matter. I mean, the deciding factor for them was that there was a picture on the wall of a forest of trees. And what I do at that age to get people to leave me alone or to get rid of, all the outside stimulation was I just stare off into space. And so I focused my eyes on this forest and did nothing but think about being in that forest instead of in that little cramped claustrophobic room with no windows and like a funky looking fluorescent light in the corner. And so I stared off at that forest, and the more the intake person said, have you ever thought about killing yourself, the more I stared off at those trees and the more I locked her out of my mind until I just cut her off completely and was, probably sobbing hysterically because I just didn't want to think about the possibility of ever thinking about something like that. And I think that because I wasn't answering that question, and she was like, it wasn't just, have you ever thought about killing yourself? I don't feel like answering that question. Okay, then we'll move on to another question. It was, tell me now. You have to tell me. If you don't answer me, like prodding. And I think that was the deciding factor on her part.
So what happened in the hospital? They took you to a children's pediatric psych ward, or where did they take you?
I went to I couldn't go to the local hospital because they wouldn't take people under 18. So I was shipped off somewhere. I don't remember where it was, another public hospital somewhere that took children. I was the youngest person on the ward, up at the very top of the hospital, whatever, 4th floor and some random little wing. And it was, tiled floors and old hospital rooms, basically, cold tiled floors and funky bathrooms with scribbled writing all over the walls. The beds had writing all over the beds. It was stuff like, so-and-so got pregnant in this bed or whatever. Just like terrible things written on the beds and the walls and the bathrooms. It was bad, and we couldn't go outside because it was just this one psych ward. At a certain point, actually, I was taking medication that made me tired, and they were supposed to check on us every 15 minutes, except I don't know if they didn't check on me or what, but I was looking out the window wishing I was home, and there was a radiator right under the window blowing hot air into my face, and I just fell asleep with my head on the radiator and burned my nose really bad. And my mom came in and said, why do you have a burned nose? And I said, I fell asleep on the radiator. It was like, well, whatever. And she's always been kind of like, well, we should probably report, but it's 5 years later now, so it doesn't really matter that the hospital, there's nothing we can do about the hospital being negligent in that situation.
What was it like being in the hospital? How long were you there, and what kinds of things happened?
I was in the hospital for that hospital for about 4 or 5 days, and was able to get transferred to another hospital, Four Winds Hospital in Katona, New York, which is an actual psychiatric hospital for children and adults of all ages, from like 4 years old, 3 years old till adult. And I was there for another week or two. Then I got out. And then I was put back in 2 weeks later. And I got out. And then I was home for 12 hours. And an ambulance and 3 police officers appeared at my door and said, you have, 1 minute to get in the car. And if you don't get in the car, or in the ambulance, if you don't get in the ambulance in, 1 minute, we'll tie you up in ropes and straps and carry you out of the house. And this was me, 12 years old, little, frail, 12-year-old girl. And they said, if you don't leave the house now, we'll lock you up.
What were you doing that made them respond this way? Were you in a really extreme emotional state or something, or what was happening?
Well, when the ambulance appeared, I basically said I wasn't going because I didn't want to go back to the hospital. And so I guess that was what made them be so forceful, but they didn't use any reasoning or anything. They didn't say like, please go kindly or whatever. It was just, get in the ambulance now. And I didn't go to my outpatient appointment or something that day. First appointment you get when you're out of the hospital. I didn't go. I said, I'm not going. And so they sent the ambulance back home.
Was the hospital helpful to you? Did you feel like it was a positive thing?
No. I guess, I went in there not suicidal. I came out more suicidal than when I went in. I never did any self-harm stuff before I went in there, except for that one night right before I went to the emergency room where I was hitting my head on stuff. I never had any situations of like anything. When I got out in the past 5 years, it's been more dramatic, more suicidal thoughts, more self, mutilation stuff, more trauma and depression than before that. And a lot of it is actually caused from nightmares from the hospital, fears from the hospital, like I'd even almost call it like post-traumatic stress disorder, just from my experiences with the hospital. Like it triggers everything. I couldn't hear the word scones I still can't hear the word scones, because I didn't know what a scone was. And when I was in the hospital, there were scones for breakfast. I mean, it was like, there's some songs that played on the radio when I was in the hospital, and like they play now, and it's like, I tell people they have to turn off the radio, and it was just that traumatizing experience.
What was so traumatizing about it?
Other than being 12 years old, being kind of like not all there emotionally or psychologically, and being forced away from your home, being forced away, like torn out of your mother's arms. There was one night when I was torn out of my mother's arms, like after the intake the second time, and being forced to, I mean, it's not even like my own state of mind, but more, it's not a very conducive healing environment when you're in a room and you hear kids screaming down the hallway, don't tie me up, don't do that to me, don't stick that in me. You're being told, oh, if you don't take these pills, then we're going to force you to take them, or we're going to stick you with needles until you take them, or stick you with needles that put the fluid inside your body. Anyways, like, I knew a certain kind of medication would do certain things to me, and I said, don't give me that medication. And they said, you can't decide that. I said, I'm not going to take that. And they said, if you don't take it, then we're going to lock you in a room, not let you out, stick you with needles until you take it, whatever. That happened to me. And just hearing other kids screaming and other kids dealing with so much of the same stuff I was dealing with. I mean, you just really had to learn to put a barrier between you and all the emotional feelings of everyone else, especially being bipolar and being able to feel.
What did they tell you was going on with you, or what was wrong with you?
They told me I was schizophrenic. They told me that I was severely depressed. They put me on a large amount of Paxil. And if you look at the studies now, it says, do not under any circumstances give a child under 18 Paxil, especially if they have a mood disorder. I had a psychotic breakdown in the hospital because of the Paxil I was on. I have no recollection of what happened. I asked my mother about it every once in a while because she was there, and she tells me things that I can't remember ever. Like, I was just totally out of it. The reason, just them not listening to me when I told them not to let me take those medications, when I said I don't want to take that medication and them forcing it on me anyways, it just made me not want to take it even more.
How did you end up getting out of the hospital?
I guess it's the same way a sly fox figures out how to get in the chicken coop. You get where you want to be. And so I guess I learned what I had to say and do so that people thought it was pretty normal and I could stay out. I learned that I could at least pretend to take my medication when I was at home instead of throwing a fit and claiming I wasn't going to take it anymore, or at least not telling my mother what was really going on in my head, or not telling people what was really going on. I think that really helped, learning to lock everything up and not tell anyone, not share any of that information.
So this is now 5 years later, and what kinds of struggles are you still having with different voices and emotional states, and then how do you deal with them? What do you think is effective?
I've been taking lithium now for, I think, almost a year. Actually, I also take Lamictal. I forgot about that. Sometimes you forget when you're just going to bed and popping pills before you sleep. Actually, my mom came to my room. This is a side note, but my mom came to my room the other day. I still have every single pill bottle, basically, for the last 7 months, just sitting next to my bed. And she said, why don't you throw those out? And I said, unlike you thinking it's depressing, seeing all these pill bottles laying around, you have to realize that this is my reality. I'm not going to keep popping pills and acting like I'm, I'm a pillhead like everyone else that pops pills. It's just that I'm taking my pills because somebody else is telling me to instead of me wanting to. And so I have these pill bottles laying all over the place. It's like my reality. But to deal with being bipolar now and all the crap that's happened over the past 5 years, one of my things my friend says is to fold cranes. I fold paper cranes. And I'm really stressed out because if I'm too stressed out, I'll tear the paper whenever I make a fold. And so as soon as I can fold a crane without tearing the paper, or do the lines just perfectly, then that means I'm calm enough to put the paper down and like continue my life.
And what kind of relationship do you have with your medication and with the diagnosis and label? Do you think that those are helpful for you? I mean, I remember earlier we were talking about, you were using the metaphor of like being in a prison. Can you talk about that?
I could talk about that. Yeah. So I have a really good friend, and we are talking about. I mean, he's very against medication. I'm not very for it, but I take it. And I was talking to him about, but when you're bipolar, it's not like you're broken when you're bipolar. You're just different, and I think you can see the world, a different world that everyone else just really can't experience. A way of dealing with the stressors of that other world so that you can live in this world. And by this world, I mean the world where you have to go to school, you have to pay the rent, you have to, act quote unquote sane, is that you can be a really good actor, but on the inside you still have this turmoil going on. And so I take medication so that I can kind of not have that inner turmoil, and I can still pretend. And he says, why pretend, when you could see this outer world? And I was kind of explaining this through a metaphor, which was that you have a prison cell, and all people that pretend or don't pretend but live in this world as you and I see it, they're inside that prison cell, and they haven't realized that the door doesn't have a lock on it. But a bipolar person finds out that the door doesn't have a lock on it, opens the door, and when they start getting diagnosed, hopefully, if they're getting diagnosed, or not necessarily hopefully, I mean, some people are undiagnosed and still amazing, beautiful people and dealing with it just fine. But you get out of your cell and you see the world as it really is, this beautiful world, this depressing world, like everything is just so much more intense for you. You see it's just so much more than what you saw inside that cell that you thought had a locked door. And when you're taking medication, you're going back in that cell purposely, and you're locking that door, and you're throwing away the key, and you're saying, I want to stay in here because it's easier to deal with, like this world where I'm not necessarily safe, but it's a world that's easier to understand than having so much more overwhelming material like pouring into your system. And I guess if you've got a house, and a roof over your head, and somebody that can care for you and feed you and give you money so you can survive, you can spend your life jumping around in that outside world and, dancing under the stars and experiencing all the depressing things in that world also. That's okay. But if you really do have to think about the fact that you do have to step back in that prison cell every once in a while and go through the rigors and routine of getting money and living life, whatever that is, then you kind of need to learn to balance that out. And I think I'm starting to do that. And maybe someday I'll be able to go off all the medications so that I can start going back into that world more easily instead of, constantly feeling locked up in this little cage.
Thanks a lot for joining us today.
Thank you.
That was 17-year-old Sonia Peterson, who was locked up in psych wards at age 12. Now we'll listen to a documentary produced by Darbey, Penney, and Peter Stastny about the Holocaust of psychiatric patients in Nazi Germany.
We were traveling well behind the German lines, and all of a sudden here in front of us was this city. It had been horribly bombed and firebombed. Total desolation. It was totally destroyed. And this was the city of Panama. On the far side of the city was another hill. And on that hill was a big high stone wall. Within it was a whole series of buildings and a big Red Cross flag on the top of the main building. And none of these buildings were touched by the bombs. So the captain of the 7th Armored came out and he said, well, I'm not going to move my tanks through the rubble until you, me and my men, would clean out and check, make sure there's no German anti-tank weapons there. So I took my men off the tanks and we went through the rubble. We finally came to the main gate and put TNT against it and blew it in, and then we charged up the side of the hill. And As we approached the buildings was a large group of what we call slaves, for lack of any other word in those days. We didn't have the word survivors and Holocaust then. They were in such an appalling condition. They were horribly starved. Their eyes were sunken way back in their heads. Soon one of my men came for me, and he said, "You better come with me." And here, along one whole wall, these big, massive oak doors, but one of them was a steel door. It could only be opened from the outside. And I looked inside, and it was a shower room. And we opened the door, and I stepped inside. There was nobody in this room, but here was human waste and blood all over the room and all over the walls and so on. It was absolutely appalling to see it. And we were trying to understand what was going on, because our government and our army had never told us a word about any of these camps before. So as I looked inside, one of my men was standing apparently in the hallway, as I remember, and he called out to me. He says, "What the hell is going on here?" And I looked over, "What's the matter?" And he turned a big wheel that was over his head, and he said, "There's no water." And then some of the slaves began to explain to me that this was a gas chamber, that they would put approximately 50 people at a time in the shower room, close the door, and the doctors would turn on the carbon monoxide, and it took up to 2 hours to kill them.
On March 26, 1945, Staff Sergeant Curtis Whiteway and his men, Special Rangers attached to the United States Army's 99th Infantry Division, liberated the mental institution at Hadamar, Germany. The atrocities they encountered were the remnants of a little-known Nazi killing operation called Action T4. Between 1939 and 1945, T4 and related operations resulted in the deaths of over 350,000 people with disabilities, primarily mental disabilities, in Germany and German-occupied territories in Europe. In the fall of 1939, Adolf Hitler signed an order authorizing his personal physician, Dr. Karl Brandt, to oversee a program that provided what was called a mercy death to people with disabilities who were deemed incurable. This order provided cover for the psychiatrists and other doctors who engaged in mass murder through Action T4. For although Hitler's order spoke of mercy deaths, the goal of this program was not to alleviate the suffering of the dying. Rather, it was to systematically exterminate disabled people who were referred to as useless eaters and lives unworthy of life. T4, the code name, refers to the Tiergartenstrasse 4, the Berlin address of Hitler's chancellery, was the culmination of a political process that included passage of a law in 1933 providing for the sterilization of disabled people. This was followed by a program for the killing of newborns and infants who were, in the language of the times, deformed or feeble-minded. Dr. Peter Stastny, Associate Professor of Psychiatry at Albert Einstein College of Medicine, discusses the beginning of the child euthanasia program.
There was a family who had a disabled child who went to this Dr. Kattel in Leipzig and had some discussions about whether this child could be taken out of his misery, or the way they put it, or relieved, in other words, killed by the doctors. And Kattel decided, well, that was an important issue, and he was going to bring it to the attention of Hitler. And Hitler became very interested in this, sent out his personal physician, Dr. Brandt, and within a few days, this child was killed. So starting with that, in early 1939, Hitler's chancellery became very actively involved in the killing of children. These people that organized the child euthanasia program were, of course, also interested in the adult euthanasia program, which was later to become T4. On August 8th, apparently, of 1939, they had a screening of a film, Unworthy Lives, which was not a finished film, but it was footage that had been shot in some of the institutions. And they screened that film for Hitler. And after the screening, Hitler said, let's do this. Hitler had this on his mind at least since 1935 and probably before. Of course, before there was a sterilization program. And the sterilization program was something that he already had talked about in Mein Kampf, which was published in the early 20s. But going beyond the sterilization program to actually killing people was a major step, because these were Aryans. These were their own German people. So they had to figure out a way to convince themselves that they weren't going to get in trouble for doing that.
The Nazi propaganda machine was engaged to help convince German physicians that Action T4 was needed to maintain the strength and racial purity of the German people. A series of films was made for this purpose, including one entitled Victims of the Past.
Alles Leben auf dieser Erde ist Kampf ums Dasein.
All life on this earth is a struggle for existence. Everything that is weak in life will inevitably be destroyed by nature. In the last few decades, mankind has sinned terribly against the laws of natural selection. We haven't just maintained life unworthy of life, we have allowed it to multiply. Whole clans are to be found in asylums. The costs of caring for the hereditarily ill siblings of this one family has so far been 154,000 Reichmarks. How many healthy people could have been housed for this sum?
This film, like Action T4 itself, was steeped in the now discredited science of eugenics. First coined in 1881 by the British naturalist Francis Galton, eugenics was described by Charles Davenport, a leading American proponent, as the science of the improvement of the human race by better breeding. The eugenics movement believed that disease and disability, as well as social problems such as poverty, were hereditary, and that the human condition could be perfected if the poor and the disabled could be persuaded or forced not to reproduce. In 1910, financed by Carnegie, Harriman, and Rockefeller money, Davenport founded the Eugenics Record Office, or ERO, at Cold Spring Harbor, New York. Under the direction of Dr. Harry Laughlin, the ERO became the leading center for eugenic research in the United States, and worked to prove that biological manipulation would result in better social planning. Dr. Patricia Deegan is a psychologist and former mental patient whose work at Boston University's Institute for the Study of Human Resilience focuses on the history of psychiatry from the perspective of patients. She talks about the impact of eugenics on Action T4.
These eugenic developments were paralleled also in Germany. But it is important for people to know that the United States was seen as a leader in developing model involuntary sterilization laws. And Harry Laughlin, the U.S. congressional expert consultant on eugenics, did receive an honorary doctorate at the University of Heidelberg in 1936. And so what we find is that the roots run long and deep, and that you really have to look at a broad picture in a number of different countries to see the power of eugenics, which swells like a tide, if you will, coming up, and then allowing a culture in a totalitarian society then to begin to cross over into a whole other thing, which is about euthanasia, so-called mercy killing, and ultimately the mass murder through formal measures such as gassing, injection, electrocution on electroshock machines, as well as more informal procedures such as letting people starve to death.
Most of the people who were involved in this at the beginning were early party members that were very rabid Nazis, and whose theory really was that they're not only treating individuals, but they're treating the body of the people. And one metaphor they always used was if the German people had a diseased leg, they have to cut it off, amputate it, to save the rest of the body. And this is one way they convinced themselves that this was the right thing to do, by saying they're not just treating individuals, but they're saving the German race, purifying it, cleansing it from this infectious, toxic waste, really. They considered people with disabilities toxic to the rest of the nation, even more so than Jews, in a certain way, because they were their own people.
And I turned my attention to a huge pile of human hair. As I walked over to it, I swung my rifle, and I stood in front of the pile of human hair, and I put my hand up over my head. That pile was higher than my hand. Somebody explained to me, one of the slaves, that they shaved all the hair off every part of the human body, and they collected all this hair, and then they would sell the hair to the manufacturers in Germany to make mattresses, make winter coats, stuff like that.
So one of the things they did right away in the summer of 1939 is develop a form that was to be filled out by all physicians caring for people with disabilities, especially with mental disabilities. And then they created a review committee of several trusted doctors. The forms came to Berlin, and the doctors that were on the committee, many of which were very prominent psychiatrists, such as Karl Schneider, who is still thought to be one of the most important contributors to research on schizophrenia, and various others. And they reviewed the forms, and they decided, based on their review of the information, which person was going to get killed. Of course, only a very, very small percentage of people ended up living. The vast majority of people who had forms filled out ended up being transported to killing centers.
What's also terrifying is that on record, we know of only one judge and one asylum superintendent who actually refused to fill out the forms and participate. And so, with participation so widespread, it really begins to make us wonder about what is possible for us as humans in terms of our own inhumanity.
The way it started to work in the fall of 1939, once Hitler had written his famous order taking the doctors off the hook, once that was in place, they started to look for institutions that could be used as killing centers. These places, such as Hartheim, Hadamar, and others, they were being prepared for the task that they were going to have. And these were relatively small institutions because they knew that people weren't going to stay there for very long. Their sole purpose at that point was to figure out how to most efficiently kill as many people as possible. So once these places had been identified and outfitted with, for instance, gas chambers, but they all had crematoria because they all needed to burn the corpses once people were killed.
And now on the end of the room was a series of ovens on fire. I have no idea. We never counted things like this in the combat. We just examined and were shocked at the things that we kept finding. As I walked over to the battery of ovens, and I looked at inside one, and here was the bodies inside them burning. And then there was another man came over, and he began to cry. And he looked at me, and he spoke broken English, and he said they, meaning the hospital staff, would take and throw young children and babies alive in those ovens on top of the bodies. And then he broke down crying, and he fell down on his knees on the floor in front of me, and he cried his heart out.
They figured out several different ways of transporting people. They used initially buses from the Postal Service, and people started to know what those buses were after a while, especially when they lived near those killing centers. Because the way it was described by people who saw it was that very soon after a bus arrived, a large cloud of smoke lifted off from that institution. And of course they had to have special people to do this job. So they recruited people locally sometimes, but many of the people were trained in Berlin and came from the core group of doctors and nurses. But there were plenty doctors from the provinces who became involved in the transporting and in the actual killing.
How do you get physicians and nurses and general practitioners to participate in the mass killing of people with disabilities? And I think that that's one of the most extraordinary achievements of the Third Reich, was to tap the potential of medicine to become willing allies in the mass murder of lives deemed unworthy of life.
Elvira Manthe was one of those identified as a life unworthy of life. The child of a family on welfare, She was diagnosed as feeble-minded at age 7 and placed in an institution. More than 50 years later, she returned to visit that institution and recalled her experiences there.
Also, der Bus hielt, es wurde aufgemacht und wir mussten aussteigen.
So the bus stopped. They opened the door and we had to get off. I was always fast, so I got off the bus quickly. Then we went into that room. In that room, they said. There were people there in white coats. On the right, there was a door, an iron door with bars. The woman who had traveled with us started giving us orders. Quick, get undressed, hurry up. There was a pile of clothes and a heap of shoes. The children got undressed. She even helped them. It was all very quick. Then she yelled at me, get undressed. And I got undressed slowly, almost in slow motion. Then I saw all those children. They were being pulled by their arms by that woman and pushed behind the iron door. The door was locked after every child. I didn't realize what had happened until after the war, when we found out about the killing of Jews and the euthanasia program. Then I realized that the children had been gassed, and that I had been allowed to turn back in front of the gas chamber. I was asked, "What is your name? How old are you?" And because I was able to answer, I very narrowly escaped death, but not the many children who were sent to their deaths through that iron door. The more I see it, the more it loses its horror. I must come to grips with it, or I will lose my mind.
One of the main points about this killing was that it was medical, and that it was actually doctors who turned on the gas and who turned off the gas when people were dead, and who observed the dying through a window pane. Once the people were taken off the bus, they were duped into thinking that they were going to be taking showers. And we know this, of course, from the concentration camps where millions of Jews were killed. But this is the place where they invented this. This is the place where they first told people you were now going to take a shower, and in fact, they were getting killed there. When I spoke to Simon Wiesenthal about this, he said he didn't think that the Holocaust would have ever happened in this manner, the way it did, without them doing this to people with mental disabilities first. He didn't think that the SS would have been able to train people adequately in doing the killings of Jews, if not first doing these killings. So I think it's unfortunate that Holocaust historians and the Holocaust museums do not emphasize it more. I think it has a lot to do with this blurring of the boundaries and with the doctors taking such an active role. I think people still don't want to point the finger too hard at doctors. We need to reconcile that. We need to reconcile where that comes from, and I don't think we're there yet. And the medical profession is certainly not making a big effort at finding that out about itself. And psychiatry, even less so. And some people just want it to go away. They don't want to think about it.
56 years later, the memory of what he found at the Hadamar Killing Center still haunts Curtis Whiteway, and he is committed to ensuring that the victims of Action T4 are not forgotten. Speaking at schools, at churches, at meetings of disability rights groups, Whiteway describes the horror he witnessed and works to overcome prejudice and hatred.
There's a lot of hatred all over the world, and the hatred being taught, generation after generation. Somebody's got to step in and teach against the hatred. And you just can't take it for granted. You've got to teach against it. That's what I'm trying to do now, today.
You've been listening to a documentary produced by Darbey, Penney, and Peter Stastny about the Holocaust of psychiatric patients in Nazi Germany. Now we have an interview with Vikki Gilbert, who was one of the leading organizers of the Freedom Center when it got started in 2001. Vikki now lives in Oregon and has recently been traveling in Europe.
Vikki, you were one of the original founders of the Freedom Center years ago, and you've had a lot of different experiences with medication and a long history with that. So I thought maybe we could just talk a little bit about, how medication didn't work for you and then the process of getting off of it.
It never worked for me, and I think that's why I kept getting more and more prescriptions for different things. And I actually had some really intensely horrible things happen in my life, and then it just kind of got to a peak. And so I was put on these different medications, and then they weren't working right, and so they gave me more.
Were you in the hospital, or?
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, I was in the hospital. Yeah, I've been in the hospital. I've been hospitalized like 5 times, I think it was. Once was involuntarily, and that wasn't a lot of fun. And it was very strange because there was really no reason to put me in. She actually asked me if I wanted to go, and I said no, and she took that as being something bad. I said, no, I'm fine. And she claimed that I refused to go, when actually that never happened, so that was quite interesting. But all I kept feeling was side effects, and I wasn't getting any relief. I was still suffering very badly. And at the same time, it was very strange because at the same time, it was like stifling and pushing down the emotions. I was feeling so much pain that I just kept taking more, and I was prescribed more. And the most I was ever on at once was 6.
What medications were you taking?
Oh, geez. I can't remember. I think there were like 20 different ones that I was on at various times over the course of 12 years.
And you had a schizophrenia diagnosis, or?
Technically schizoaffective, but that changed. I'm also the woman of 1,001 or 101 diagnoses.
So these were antipsychotics. These were mood stabilizers.
Yeah, antipsychotics, mood stabilizers, antidepressants, minor tranquilizers, the benzos, the Ativan and stuff like that.
What kind of side effects did you have from them?
Very sleepy, sluggish, weight gain. The akathisia was really bad. I felt like that's a side effect where I felt like I was coming out of my skin. And I became suicidal from that because the feeling was so intense. And I was given benzos and also sleeping pills. I was on Ambien for a while too. And that still didn't help enough. So that's actually what my last hospitalization was.
This was in the system in Hampshire County?
Yes. Yeah.
Where,
in Franklin County, too.
So what hospitals and what agencies were you part of?
Let's see. Holyoke Hospital, Franklin Medical Center, East Spoke, and I don't remember what the agency was in Franklin County. I was also a service client for some time, and also DMH, former DMH client, Department of Mental Health or Mental Illness, I'm not sure.
So when you complained about these side effects, they just added more pills?
Yeah, to counteract the side effects from the medication. But it was mostly my complaints. I guess I kind of figured that I had to put up with them because I was suffering so badly and I was so desperate for some kind of help to make all of it stop that I was willing to put up with whatever I could put up with, and far more than I wanted to. I was, like I said, on 6 sometimes at once. And when I started tapering off, I was on 3 at that time. But I didn't even like taking like an aspirin or anything like that. I just never liked taking anything for anything. And here I was on all this stuff.
And what kinds of things were going on in your mind and with your emotions while all this is happening?
I actually was not very... I'm not sure how present I was. I was living a lot, I think, in what had happened to me in the past. And I was kind of here sometimes. I watched a lot of television, so I tried not to think too much, And it's kind of hard to think because the thought process is interrupted, and I couldn't do any poetry or anything anymore, which I'd always loved to write. And any kind of creativity was just, it was gone because I was not there. I was not myself anymore.
And this went on for several years?
12 years. Just about 12 years, maybe 11, yeah.
So then something happened and you started to think about it and ended up going off the medications, right?
Yeah, and the first thing that actually happened to me was that I started performing poetry at the local cafe. And that was actually encouraged by an outreach worker I had when I was a DMH client. And I ended up doing that. And that really just saved my butt. It really did. And it kind of like brought me out. I was kind of very, I didn't talk to people. I didn't like interacting with people because I guess I just felt weird. And I felt a heaviness inside of me too. The performing aspect of it. And just getting to meet actually people who like weren't labeled, because I was in this kind of like crowd where it was weird. The dynamic was different for me, and it was kind of like I could never really be a normal person or something, and I couldn't have a conversation with somebody who was a normal person, so to speak. I don't really like that kind of terminology, but so I started doing that, and as I did that, I started making more connections with people. And I started feeling a lot better. And then I decided that I was feeling better, so I'm like, like I said, I don't like taking anything, really. So I told my therapist that I wanted to stop taking one of the medications, which was an antidepressant. That's what I started with first. And she didn't like that, and neither did my psychiatrist, but I'm very stubborn, so I did it anyway. With their assistance, actually. I got assistance with that. It took me like a year and a half to taper off of everything.
How did you taper off exactly?
Actually, I came to find out later on that it was a little too fast, because I really like what Peter Bergen wrote in his book about decreasing by 10% slowly. And I had assistance going off the antipsychotic and the antidepressant. And then when I went off, I was on Neurontin also. When I went off that, I did that by myself. And I did it actually slower, I think. And I wish that they had gone slower. And what happened actually to me, and when I started this process, I didn't know anything about this. I was just like, I want to get off this stuff. Because I felt like crap and I couldn't move. And, I couldn't even shower most of the time because I was just so, and it made me more depressed. It was awful. They started tapering me off, and I was off of the first one, the antidepressant. And I think it was like within 2 weeks, they wanted me to come back, and they said, "How are you feeling?" Well, and I said, "Well, I'm not feeling that great, Are you depressed?" I said, "Yeah, And she wanted me to go back on it, my psychiatrist, and I said, "Well, no, I just want to try this. I'll be okay." I just knew I'd be okay. I knew I would. And actually, the same thing happened with the antipsychotic as well, which was Zyprexa. I was on Zyprexa at that time.
So how hard was it to go off of these meds, and what kinds of things did you go through?
Oh my gosh. It was harder than I thought it would be. And it wasn't just a matter of tapering off in the right way, because even like tapering off very, very slowly, it's still your body feels the effects, because my body, especially with me, I can speak from my perspective because I was on it for 12 years, so it's going to be different for everybody, and I'm certainly, not a medical professional, and I don't want to give out any advice, but I could say what my experience was. I had physical symptoms, and I got sick a lot. It was like my body was trying to just rebalance itself. I got physically sick a lot. But the hardest thing for me was actually emotionally. And I thought, okay, and this was definitely the right thing to do. I let everybody know, who was a friend and a supporter, what I was doing and how I was doing it, and said, I'm gonna need some extra support. So, and that was important. But what I didn't realize was that it was kind of a sneaky thing, because I knew that there was 12 years at least of emotions bottled up there. They were just gonna like, rah, like some kind of like monster being coming out of my ears and eyes or something. So probably mouth too, thinking about it. So, but what I didn't understand was that it actually lasted for a really long time. The emotional stuff, just releasing it and trying to remember what I was like before, and even different than that, because I had changed over time as well. Anyway, it snuck up on me, and because it was like I was in this space where my body was tense, And emotionally, I was tense. So I couldn't really tell that the tension kept rising and rising because it was like in small increments. But this lasted for a good year. This was going on, and I didn't even recognize it, I think, until like the storm had like died, that this was really what was going on. Because, I just thought, well, here it is, this is the way I am, this is what came back, but it was just a release, and a release, and a release, and a release. And actually, I'm convinced part of the reason why I developed this carpal tunnel and this pain, chronic pain stuff that I have, is because, like, I was doing a lot of stressful work, and at the same time, my emotions were kind of, like, off the scale, and I'm typing, and my body's tensing up, and using a bad keyboard as well, so it didn't help any. And so I see this all as being connected, this physical action. I mean, you could say it was a typing. I really think it was my process. And I think that I still have some pain, and I think that's still part of my process working out. I figured that if I was on medication for like 12 years, it's going to take a while to kind of like, get back in sync to kind of, and that's been happening. And I had a lot of like damage from the chemicals to my brain, and things are coming back. My memory's gotten a lot sharper. Within the first year, I was really concerned about a lot of things, my thought process, reading, and stuff like that.
So the medications had caused all these serious problems with your brain.
Yeah, and I didn't realize how much so until I stopped taking the stuff, because while I was on it, I was so out of it. And then when I started kind of like becoming more aware and my thought process started improving, I realized how different it was. And I thought about the kind of before and after. And it definitely, but like I said, I think I've even seen improvement in the past year. And it's been 4 years now, over 4 years now.
What kinds of things do you do to take care of yourself in this whole process of coming off these medications and putting your life back together?
A lot of different things. I love going into nature, and it's just very soothing to me, the trees and the animals and the rocks and stuff. And also art and poetry and jewelry making. I still love to poet. As I say, always with my socks on, or sometimes with my socks off, but never with my shoes on. That's very important. If you think that you've seen me poeting, but the person is wearing shoes, that is not me unless it is freezing cold.
Do you have words of advice that you would give to people who are on medication and considering going off of them, and what might be the things that they need to take into account and think about?
Definitely the emotional aspect of it. And like I said, I think that varies from person to person. And of course, depending on how long you've been taking stuff. And just like the support, the emotional support is just so important for me. And to just know that like maybe there's a possibility that things could be more intense than you feel that they are at the moment. So to just, and if your body starts, like tensing up, and that's probably why everything's just kind of rushing out.
Thanks a lot for joining us, Vikki Gilbert.
That was an interview with Freedom Center organizer Vikki Gilbert. And that's about all the time we have this week on Madness Radio. Thanks a lot for tuning in.
You've been listening to Madness Radio, Voices and Visions from Outside Mental Health. Madness Radio is broadcast every Wednesday, 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on Pacifica affiliate WXOJ-LP-FM 103.3 Valley Free Radio in Northampton, Massachusetts. For our live internet stream, podcasting, show archives, and more, visit madnessradio.net. Madness Radio is co-produced by Freedom Center and the Icarus Project. For more information, check out freedom-center.org and theicarusproject.net. For more mental health radio, listen to the News Hour from mindfreedom.org, Wednesdays, 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you have an idea for a story or guest on Madness Radio, or you just want to share what's in your head, contact us at radio@madnessradio.net.